So as you guys can hear, I just started recording this webinar so that everybody will be able to see it. But David, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
Excellent.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, excellent. If you want to just, I should have kept your bio right in front of me, but I did not. So if you want to start out by telling folks a little bit about yourself, that would be fabulous.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Carol and NCAN, for inviting me to speak and for setting all this up. My name is David Ismay. I'm an attorney at Conservation Law Foundation in our Boston office, and I specialize in clean energy and climate change policy. I come from a background of being a law firm lawyer, and I was in the Navy for a little while before that. Now I'm working full-time on climate change. CLF, if you don't know us, we're a member-supported environmental nonprofit that works just in New England, in the 6-state New England region, using law, science, and the market to create solutions and that can preserve our natural resources, build healthy communities, and sustain a vibrant and clean economy. So next slide. Tonight I am going to give an overview of electric power systems to start with, our grid, and also describe the special role that municipal utilities, which are city-owned electric utilities, munis, play, particularly here in Massachusetts, although they exist around New England and outside New England. The last thing I'll do is talk about the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and for Massachusetts, the new Clean Energy Standard, the RPS and CES, and how those tie in with munis. Next slide. So this is a sketch of what our electricity grid looks like, and we'll be going back and forth to this slide throughout the night. And so the first thing I'm going to do is walk you through the basic parts of our grid and how they work together. Next slide, please. The first main division that to be aware of, or that we can say, is this one. On the left side, you see the high voltage power side of the grid. Sometimes that's what most people just think of as the grid, but it's a wholesale energy side where energy is generated and transmitted, and then the local distribution and retail side on the right side. Next, please. So first, we're going to talk about this left side, the high voltage power side. Next slide. This is where, like I said before, most electricity is generated, traditionally at large power plants. And here you can see on the left a smokestack plant, something burning fossil fuels. In the middle, a dam, a hydropower plant. And on the right side there, a large wind farm. So it doesn't necessarily mean renewable or not, but traditionally these have been fossil-based resources built centrally. And then next slide. You see the other half, the other component of the high voltage power side is high voltage transmission, sending that power from a central station of whatever kind over a relatively long distance. And there's two of those arrows on the left and the right are pointing to transformers. So one of the things about long distance transmission, and part of the reason it's expensive, is that you take the power from a power plant, you boost the voltage up to several thousands or tens of thousands of volts, send it over these high tension, high power lines, and then you have to pull the voltage back down to a level where we can use it. And that's on the right side of the slide, which we'll get to next.
And I apologize, I should have said this right at the beginning, but what we'll do is that as you think of questions you can go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll do a moderated question and answer at the end. I know I promised you guys that David would answer your questions, which we will get to, but just go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll gather them so that we can have him answer those at the end.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so now we'll talk about the right half of this picture, and that's the local distribution or retail side of the grid, and that's where we find most of us folks who use the power that's generated on the left side. Next slide. So now we're on slide 11, just in case anybody's looking at this later. There are two major pieces here on this side of the grid. The first is another smaller set of transformers and wires, and we call that the distribution system. And those are generally the wires that are running down all of our streets into our houses and buildings. That operates at a couple hundred volts rather than at several thousand volts. Next slide. And then the fourth component is us. It's the people who use power in their homes or their businesses, and you'll hear it's called a number of things. Customers to the utilities, or ratepayers if you're talking to the regulators, they call us ratepayers. And maybe the least glamorous name that you see here is load, which is an electrical engineering term for something that draws or uses power. So in a simple circuit, and the grid is just a big circuit, but in a simple circuit that maybe had a battery and a switch connected by wires to a light bulb, the electrical engineers call the light bulb the load, the thing that's consuming the power. Next slide. We also see something interesting in this diagram, some cool stuff we'll talk about later. We've got a couple rooftop solar panels there. Those are generating power, and interestingly, those arrows you see in green are flowing the other way. So one of the new things about renewables that grid operators are not as comfortable with, but are getting more comfortable with, is that the power will flow in both directions. And you also see a new kind of load there, an electric vehicle, an EV plugged in to a house. Next slide. The next thing I want to do is show you how this physical structure gets reflected in your electricity bill. This one is one from my family, August 2015, so a few years ago. $151.55, already paid, but if anybody wants to pay my bill, that's okay. Just kidding. So next slide. This is the front, and then on the back of this bill, and I'm guessing even in muni towns it looks a lot like this. You'll see on the left, it's a breakdown by month of how much power we use at my house. And then on the right is the part we're going to focus on, the cost of electricity, and it's a breakdown of where the $151 comes from. Next slide. So here at the top, it's just highlighted, about half of the cost of monthly electricity, and this is for most people, regardless of whether you're in a muni town or a utility served by utility like I am, or I should say a privately owned utility. About half of the cost of electricity is for delivery services. And I'll show you those next slide. Those are paying for the wires. So there's two sets of wires to pay for, the high voltage transmission wires and the local distribution wires. The wires on the high voltage side, the left, are generally owned by private companies now and overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. They're managed locally by the regional grid operator. Here, that entity is called the Independent System Operator, or ISO New England. The wires on the right side are owned by your local monopoly utility, like Eversource, or in a muni town, it's owned by the municipal light plant itself. Next slide. So back to the back of my electric bill, you see the other half of my bill is actually paying for the electricity that I use. Here they're called supplier services, and there's a basic service fixed charge per kilowatt. And if you go next slide, these are the electrons themselves, and so the money there is actually going to pay the generators. It also goes, I have two circles there, it's paying the generators themselves in red. It's also where the money to pay the regional grid operator comes from. So that's all wrapped up in the cost of electricity. Next slide. And just since I brought it up before, there's a roughly the counterpart to ISO New England on the left side is the state agency that manages the local utility. In Massachusetts, it's our Department of Public Utilities, or DPU. In other states, it might have a different name, the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, or in Connecticut, for example, it's called the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, or PURA. But essentially, the high voltage side, the generation and the long distance transmission is managed by the feds and locally by the grid operator. The left side is generally managed by the state under state law. And to a certain extent, that's the same in a muni town as well. Next slide. Okay, so we're moving on. We're a third of the way through. What do munis do? We now can answer that question and show where they fit in. Next slide. So here's the answer. They can do it all. Municipal utility is a mini utility. It can own what I call the whole stack, and I'll show you what I mean by that. It can own generation. It can actually own transmission lines, although not many of the Massachusetts munis own a lot of high-power transmission. They own all the lines on your street, and they are your primary and only retail energy seller. So next slide. Show you what I mean by the stack here. We're back to our picture that we just used, and they're the four components that I mentioned before: generation and transmission on the high voltage side, distribution and retail on the local distribution side. And if we lay those out top to bottom instead of left to right, next slide, it looks like this. And this is what I meant when I said they can own the whole stack. So again, I've just listed those same four components vertically. And the reason I like to do that, next slide, is because all of this stuff used to be done across the U.S. By vertically integrated monopoly utilities. And this is the vertical integration that we're talking about. These were traditionally private companies, so investor-owned companies that were heavily regulated by the state, here again the DPU in Massachusetts. And that was the traditional model that prevailed for over 100 years until the early 1990s, when in Massachusetts and in most of New England and throughout about 50% of the United States, we decided to try a different model. So next slide. And that model we went through restructuring, where we restructured the system, and what we did was to pull apart this vertically integrated monopoly system, and we decided to rely less on regulation of vertically integrated monopolies and more on markets. Next slide. So I know it's getting a little complicated here, but I want to give everybody, let you know there's a general system out there that you'll hear a lot about, and I'll show you where munis fit in again in just a second. So in Massachusetts, the vast majority of the state, except for municipal light towns, is a restructured market-based system. Now, generation is owned by IPPs, or independent power producers. These are companies you may have heard of: Exelon, NRG, Calpine, Invenergy, private companies whose business it is to own generation and sell electrons and other services into regional markets. Transmission is owned, and this is really creative, by transmission owners, or TOs, as they're called. Both of those sets of private companies are essentially regulated by ISO New England. So it's less state regulation, but not completely unregulated. But they don't have a lot of regulation, and they make their money, again, in these federally regulated markets. Below the TOs, you'll see the EDCs. That stands for Electric Distribution Companies. And these are the companies that most folks outside of Unitown would identify as their, quote, utility. It was Boston Electric before, and then it was Eversource. But these are, in Massachusetts, Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. And these companies are still actually very heavily regulated by the DPU, and they still are monopolies, geographic monopolies. They own the distribution wires, and no one else can own them either, so they're a monopoly. And so it's just nice to note that sort of deregulation and restructuring didn't get rid of all regulation or even monopolies altogether, but it certainly broke up the traditional, you can think of it as breaking up Ma Bell and AT&T into other companies that are still regulated, but not in the same way. And then at the bottom, there are retail sellers. These are companies that register with the state to sell electricity. And one of the goals of restructuring was to unleash competition at the household level, that we could buy our electrons from whomever offered them at the best price. That didn't work quite as planned. 80% of residential customers in Massachusetts are still buying power essentially from their old monopoly utility, now called an EDC. But the numbers are reversed for commercial and industrial customers. About 70% of businesses do buy their power from retail energy sellers, and they often do it on longer-term contracts so they have a stable business budget. Next slide. And so into this sort of messy slide, at least, or messy world, where are munis? They're on the left. And when I said municipal light plants can do it all, they are still vertically integrated monopoly utilities. But instead of being owned by investors, it's owned by private shareholders, and this is pretty neat, they are owned by towns. Owned locally, like your library or your police station or the fire trucks in the fire station, those are all owned by the citizens of the town. So really in a municipal light plant town, you own the wires, and if they own generation, you own it as well. While, again, the old investor-owned utilities were heavily regulated by the DPU, municipal light plants are regulated by the DPU, but very lightly, and their real direction they're really self-regulated under the supervision of a 3 to 5 person elected light board or municipal light plant commission. They have different names in different towns, but these are elected citizens who then are responsible for hiring and firing a full-time professional utility manager who will run the light plant. And they are like the CEO of an old vertically integrated utility, running a business, hiring and managing a full-time staff that works to make sure the town has enough electricity. Next slide. And munis are an important part of the system here in Massachusetts. You can see on this map in pink, the muni towns are highlighted, and there are about 50 towns that are served by, I believe, 44 municipal light plants. So a few municipal light plants serve more than one town, usually adjacent geographically. And they're scattered across the entire state, as you can see. And they're also, interestingly, they're interspersed in and among the monopoly territories of the privately owned electric distribution company utilities. Eversource in green, National Grid in purple, and at the top you can see 4 small areas that are served by Unitil, which is much bigger in New Hampshire, but another privately owned utility. And altogether, all those pink municipal areas account now for about 15% of all the electricity consumed in Massachusetts. So a pretty significant portion. Next slide. So before I said the simple answer to what munis could do was they could do it all, and here's what I meant, and we'll talk a little bit more about that now. So unlike the big investor-owned utilities, unlike Eversource or National Grid, for example, munis are allowed to own their own generating facilities. That vertical integrated monopoly was never pulled apart, so they are allowed to own generation. The smaller munis tend not to own much generation. They buy it all. But the larger ones do own some, either by themselves or in groups of muni towns that purchased a plant together. They own fossil fuel plants, now mainly, actually only gas and oil-fired plants. Many of them have small ownership shares in various nuclear plants in New England. Some own shares in hydropower, and several of them have a little bit of wind and solar power. And then, like I said before, the munis handle the entire right side of the equation. They own and maintain the local wires and substations and switches and all the electrical engineering stuff that delivers power from the high voltage side down to your homes. And in their territory, they are the only retail seller of electricity allowed in the town they serve. So the next thing I want to do is give you an example of how the munis handle the left side of this equation, and it's what they call their supply portfolio. Next slide. Okay. So here's an example. This is from their website, from the Hingham Light Plant, 2016, and this is what they report as their energy supply. And it's a great graphic. Hingham is one of the larger and also one of the more progressive munis as far as clean energy goes. So I'll just talk you through this real quick. We'll start at the top and go clockwise. You can see in blue, Hingham gets almost 30% of its electricity from ownership shares in the Seabrook Nuclear Power Station in New Hampshire and the Millstone Nuclear Power Station in Connecticut. Moving to the right, clockwise in green, you can see about 14% of their power is coming from hydropower and wind, and a little bit of solar. And then in something I guess I'll call taupe, some sort of brown, below that, 5% of the power is from local gas and oil-fired generators. The Potter, Watson, and Stony Brook plants were the kind that I described earlier, where a group of 8 or 10 munis got together and through an agent, MWEC purchased and built, or I should say built and own their own gas and oil-fired generation. Below that, in light purple, you see about 4% of their power is coming from 2 small landfill to gas power plants, and that's, if you don't know, that's where methane from landfills is captured instead of being flared, which is where they just burn it as it comes out of the landfill. They put it in a pipe, dry it out, and they use it to run a generator. And then across the bottom, from about 4 o'clock to 9 o'clock on the wheel in dark yellow, about 48% of Hingham's power is coming in one way or another from somebody else, essentially through the regional power grid. Next slide. And here's one thing that makes munis unique. As I mentioned before, munis are allowed to own generation while the privately owned large electric distribution utilities are not. And this is an example of how that plays out. Hingham has ownership interest in about half of the power it uses. And so that's that 29% of nuclear, 14% of hydro and wind and solar, the 5% of fossil, and the 4% of landfill. Next slide. And again, unlike actually large private utilities, again, over half of the rest is purchased on price-stable long-term contracts, which really leaves over at, I guess that's between 7 and 9:30 on the wheel. I've got it labeled as spot, and Hingham labels it as the ISO energy interchange. 20% of their power they buy day to day on the spot market. The rest of it they either own up at the top, or that other 28% they have long-term contracts for. Why do they do that? Well, just like a lot of large businesses or campuses, universities that have a fairly stable need for a lot of electricity, and a dislike for the risk that comes with playing the spot market, where you can have very high prices at times and also very low prices. A lot of munis, like a lot of businesses, large businesses, enter into long-term contracts. So they either own or have under long-term contracts 70 or actually 80% of the power that they think they will need. And the other reason they do that is they don't want to overbuy. So they have a pretty good idea, and they enter into a lot of long-term contracts or ownership for 80% of their power, and then that leaves them about 20% to buy day-to-day as they need it. Next slide. So what is the RPS and the CES, and what do they have to do with this? Next slide. The RPS, again, is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and the CES is the Clean Energy Standard. Lots of states, around about 35 states in the country, have RPSs. Right now, Massachusetts is one of the only, or the only state that also has a CES, but they are essentially identical types of programs. Both of them are a set of regulations that require retail electricity sellers to sell a certain percent of low or non-emitting electricity each year. The amount required goes up each year, and right now in Massachusetts, both programs together require Massachusetts retail sellers to have 80% clean energy by 2050. That's pretty good, and Massachusetts is one of the leading states here, but there's a slight hitch. Next slide. I have to qualify. These programs apply to all sellers of electricity in Massachusetts except for munis. Munis have been exempted from both programs. Why? It was basically a political bargain. It's interesting to note that there is a municipal light plant town in every single Massachusetts senator's district, and they are well organized and they have good lobbyists. And when the RPS went into effect, they handled less of the power in Massachusetts, and they essentially said, we're too small, don't worry about us. At 2050, all that global warming stuff is way, way far in the future. It'll just cost us too much. And they were allowed to be exempted, or they fought for an exemption and were successful, despite the constant and loud objection of just about every group that works on climate change. And so I think it's an issue near and dear to the hearts of many who are attending the presentation. And the question is, how do we change that politically and get the munis into these programs, either these programs or another one that will require them to do their part in moving towards a clean energy future. And I think the real answer to that is through all of your hard work at the local level, influencing or changing the leadership of each one of your munis. So I wanted to just arm you with a few facts about the situation with the munis. Next slide. And to do so, I'll very quickly just recap how these two programs work. So both the Clean Energy Standard and the Renewable Portfolio Standard work this way. Qualifying generators, when they generate 1 megawatt hour of electricity, for each megawatt hour they generate, a credit is created and logged out of thin air in a central accounting system, ping, and they say this power plant or this windmill, wind turbine just generated 1 credit, and a credit equals 1 megawatt hour. So the credit goes into the system, into the database, and the power goes into the grid. And the way that you track as a user on the other side into the greenhouse that you're actually using clean power is that you sort of reconnect the credit with the electrons. So as you draw power, whether you're a home or a business, the only way you can claim the green electron that came out of the wind turbine is if you also have a REC. Next slide. And as programs, the way that these programs are resulting or driving more and more renewables onto the system is that the utilities are the ones generally, since the munis are exempted, the utilities are required to turn in a certain volume of credits at the end of each year. Right now, it's at 12% of their total load. And there's that horrible word again. So whatever the amount of electricity they normally sell in megawatt hours, 12% of that in 2017 has to be clean. And the way they do that is to own RECs. So these programs require the utilities to turn them in. That means they need to get them, which means these credits all of a sudden have a value. They have to buy them from the people who generate them. And so they have value, and renewable generator owners can sell the RECs. But here's the rub. Because the MLPs sell electricity, but they don't have to turn in credits, they sell them. They sell those credits because they're valuable to utility. So it's income from the MLPs, and there you can see my frowny face. I have to pay for them, but people in municipal towns don't. And there's another problem with that. It's that a lot of municipal light plants right now are essentially double counting their clean electricity. And what do I mean by that? They'll say, like Hingham, and I'm not accusing Hingham, but in a presentation they will show clean power and say, here's our power, it's clean. But as soon as they sell the REC, remember, whoever has the REC is the only one who can claim the clean energy. So if you sell the REC, you don't own the clean power anymore and you can't claim it. But essentially right now, because the municipal light plants don't have to comply with these programs, but because their consumers have demanded clean energy, thanks to you guys, and it really is a big deal that that's happened, they own these RECs and are selling them. So next slide. That raises the question of how should munis come in? I think it's clear that they have to come in at some point because they are 15% of all the electricity in Massachusetts, and that's too large of a piece of our total generation to leave out of the equation. And we know that some munis would be sort of just fine. Here, Hingham, by my math, this was, again, in 2016. In 2016, the RPS required 11%. And it looks to me that Hingham was probably above the RPS. So they were outperforming the RPS as long as they didn't sell those RECs. If they didn't sell the credits and they retired them and no one else could claim that clean power, then they would have no problem complying with the RPS. And even for Hingham, they would still have excess RECs that they could sell. Next slide. And I think this is almost my last slide, second to last slide, so we're almost done. So bringing the MLPs into the fold, I'd say, and I mean by that complying with our climate law, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008, or the GWSA. What does it mean for MLPs? It really means that their revenue stream is going to change. So for the munis that have renewables, most of them are selling the RECs because they don't have to turn them in, and bringing them into the program means there's probably a loss of revenue. And I bring that up so that you guys are armed with that when you talk to your light plant managers. It's going to be on their minds when you talk to the town board. Right now, that money is coming into the town, and this is really difficult. It's coming into the town. It's going to things like schools and libraries and police cars, or lower taxes, and so it's not a minor change that I'm talking about, or an unimportant one. One other question, and we saw Hingham has about 30% of its power coming from nuclear power. Right now, nuclear power does not qualify in the RPS, and that's because it was originally designed to incentivize new things at the time, like solar and wind, and nuclear has been around and honestly had good federal subsidies since the late 40s, early 50s. So existing nuclear was not in the program. It's also not in the clean energy standards. So if munis are brought into these programs or something like it, there's a big question of how their existing nuclear should be treated, because we see it as, we all understand it is non-emitting, and if carbon emissions are what we're after, then that's an issue. And the last thing is I showed you data from Hingham in 2016. They're ahead of the game, but some MLPs are way behind, and they own no wind and solar. They have shares only in fossil fuel plants, and then they buy all their power from fossil fuel plants on the grid. And so it's hard. This is an issue that goes town by town, and unfortunately, a lot of the advocates for munis roll everybody into one, and they cherry pick a little, and they pick the best munis like Hingham or Worcester or Concord that are pretty clean and ahead of state standards, and act as if all munis are that way. And unfortunately, some munis are haven't done very much at all for clean power. So my last slide is a graph you may have seen. This is a state graph from DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, showing what the kind of trajectory we're looking at to get from that dotted line, a 25% level, that's our 2020 requirement, all the way down to 80% or below 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. For that to happen for the state, the entire state's energy supply needs to be about 96% cleaner than it is. And I say this only to emphasize there's no way that the state can make its mandate unless the munis, which have 15% of the electric power sector in the state, unless those munis are included and are also driving their energy supply similarly to be almost zero emissions. And that's all I have. I'll stop right now and hand it back over to Carol, and I'd love to answer any questions you have.
Great. Thank you, David. So I've gathered a bunch of questions that folks have asked. Folks can see there's a slide up that has my email address and Oriana's email address. So if folks have questions after we finish asking David a bunch of the questions, and after we finish tonight, then please go ahead and send us an email. So David, one of the first questions, I just see that someone is asking a question as to whether you said, is it 50 or 15% of the customer load that's in munis? And so... Yes,
sorry, it's 15%. 15% of state load is handled by munis.
Great. Great. And why don't we actually, can folks just put questions in the chat rather than trying to answer each other's questions? Because I think probably since we have an expert like David here, we want to go ahead and utilize him. So one question that someone asked is, could munis or municipal light plants break even if they do not sell their RECs, their renewable energy credits?
I think the answer there is yes, absolutely, but they would be finding that money somewhere else, which means that probably rates would go up. And that's something that no one likes. But right now, most of the munis in Massachusetts, for a number of reasons, are the rates are the lowest in the state. So there are munis that have rates about 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and what I pay, and really have very little choice to pay, is more like 14 or 15 cents per kilowatt hour. The highest rates in the state are close to 18 cents per kilowatt hour. So I don't know exactly how much it would have to come up, but it would only be probably 1 or 2 cents. I mean, you might come up from 10 to 11 or from 10 to 12 and still be cheaper than anybody served by Eversource or National Grid.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked a question. I'm going to try and sort of group things by maybe REC price questions and how folks structure RECs, and then get to a couple of the other different categories. So somebody asked if somebody said that they had heard that Vermont sells all their renewable energy credits and uses the proceeds to build more renewables. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, actually. That's interesting. I don't know. My understanding, though, I thought Vermont had a renewable portfolio standard as well.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Which would require at least some of them to be settled, but Vermont is ahead of where Massachusetts is, so it could be that they are selling some of them into Massachusetts or New York or Connecticut and making some money there.
Yep. So somebody asked a great question, which was, what happens to the price of RECs when the price of renewable energy becomes the same as dirtier ways of producing electricity?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that the overall price, that price is what drives it, but the price of RECs right now, and what people talk about is very responsive to, it's a supply and demand. So if there are more credits out there than are required to be turned in every year, there's a glut, and the price for the credit, the REC, drops. That's one of the reasons that a lot of advocates are pushing for the RPS to be raised so that it goes not from 12% this year to 13%, but to 15%, and jumps at higher increments, is so that the RECs will maintain a value because they're in demand.
Great. So somebody asked, who determines the rates of the investor-owned utilities, and do they save us money because they have economies of scale and they're buying obviously much larger amounts of electricity?
Great question. The Department of Public Utilities determines the rates that the investor-owned utilities can charge to folks like me. So you may have heard Eversource just finished a big rate case, and that's one of the things that was at issue is there's two sides to the equation. How much money does Eversource need to cover its expenses? And then once they come up with that pot of money, they divide it up by coming up with rates. How much are commercial, industrial, residential, low income? There's lots of different categories. And interestingly, even though the investor-owned utilities do have that larger purchasing power, they typically, and this isn't just in Massachusetts but across the country, are more expensive than publicly owned power like munis. And it's probably complex. There are different reasons, but one is that they're paying their shareholders. So there's a profit element to it, and that is something that municipal light plants and other public power don't have. So they typically, public power typically beats privately owned utilities on price.
We've got a bunch of grid questions, and somebody asked if Hingham is connected directly to Seabrook when you were talking about sort of where they get their, when you were showing that pie chart of where they get their electricity.
Yeah, I certainly don't know for sure, but I do not think so. That works the way they say we get our electricity from Seabrook is that they've got an ownership interest, and like RECs, which show you there's a disconnect sometimes between the path of ownership and the path of electrons, that's the same all over the grid. If I am a retail seller or buyer, I'll enter into a contract with my lawyers doing the work, and in the accounting that the grid operator does, they account for the energy and say X% of Seabrook's power this day went to Hingham, and even though the electrons generally flow into the grid, and after they hit the wires, we can't tell where any of the electrons came from or where they go.
Yeah. Somebody asked, and this may be a question for an electrical engineer, but they asked, would a DC grid be better than the current grid?
That's a great question. I don't know if it would be better. One of the advantages of DC is that there is less loss over the line. It's really good for long-distance transmission. So right now, the big power lines that are being contemplated to come from Canada with hydropower and hopefully a lot of wind right into Boston, those are all high voltage DC lines, HVDC. So they have very low line loss. But I don't think we're probably not going to transform our entire grid because we've got a lot of sunk cost and value in the wires that are out there. They're all alternating current or AC. That said, there are people talking about a DC grid, at least on the distribution side, because more and more with computers and electronics, something like about half of the load in residential homes is now DC. So all those power converters you plug in for your iPhone or your laptop, those are taking alternating current, putting it back into DC to go into the computer. And with the rise of all that electronics, you're seeing fewer and fewer motors out there like a washing machine or something that needs an alternating current. So it could happen.
So somebody asked a question about how the picture of the grid changes when people are making more of their electricity locally and having more distributed generation like solar and local wind and geothermal.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that is being discussed all over in utility boardrooms and policy shops. What we do know is that the existing grid can take about, as is, you could have about 30% of the power generated on the grid be distributed and renewable. So I'm thinking intermittent variable generation like solar and wind. At some point, at very high levels, maybe closer to 50%, parts of the grid would probably have to be rewired, essentially because everybody built it thinking that power was going to flow in one direction. And now that it's flowing in two directions, there are safeties and switches and things like that that probably need to be sort of rewired and replaced. That's at a very technical level. At a more policy level, the more distributed renewables come on, the less need we have for those big central power stations. We see the grid gets very responsive because the generators are close to the load, to the users. And it also, a lot of people think if we do it right, the grid would be more resilient. A big storm comes, it knocks the power line out. But if you have generation on both sides instead of just on one side, then at least some set of lights will still stay on.
So in relation to that, we had a couple microgrid questions, which I'll ask, but first somebody asked if more local generation, more distributed generation will mean reduced distribution charges.
That is a great question, and it's really a policy question. So one of the unfortunate things that happened in this Eversource rate case was Eversource asked for a fixed charge to be levied on every owner of solar in its area. Their argument for doing that is that as more people generate locally, there are fewer people using fewer numbers of kilowatt hours, and so the cost of the wires that is distributed over everybody who buys power, there are fewer and fewer people, and so it's somehow inequitable. And really, that's not something we support, and I don't think it's the way that the future has to go. But it's a question: how are we going to pay for the wires? Will it be through fixed charges? Some people think it could be through property tax. If your property is hooked up to the system, you pay a flat fee, $2,000 a year. There's different ways to do it. There are some costs, and as more and more people use distributed generation, but the real problem I have is not conceptual. It's that right now we have so few people who have solar, and any inequity or problem with the distribution of those costs happens when we have 10, 15, 100, 1,000 times more users than we have now. So.
Great. So there were a couple questions about microgrids, as I mentioned. Somebody asked if there are any towns on the Cape that have microgrids, and I know this isn't necessarily your area, Dave. So,
yeah,
let me know if this is something
no,
you can answer.
I don't know if they do. Although, interestingly enough, I just was talking to somebody who is a business person, and he's working to use more microgrids on the Cape because they have a number of development, almost moratoria on the Cape with respect to wastewater and other things. One thing the Cape has that's interesting and not quite a microgrid is they have the Cape Light Compact, which isn't a muni, but it's a early aggregation of towns that are served by Eversource into almost like a muni. And the Cape Light Compact has a lot of power to serve local people, and so it isn't quite a microgrid, but there's some interesting things on the Cape.
Yeah, and there was another question. There was a little bit of chatter between some folks about Sterling and their storage project and whether Sterling qualifies as a microgrid.
I don't know exactly. I mean, the definition of a microgrid is still somewhat in flux, and people selling microgrid services, might call something a microgrid. It's usually, in its truest sense, it's usually something that can sustain itself for a large portion of the load locally. Microgrids are usually tied into the main grid, so some people think of it as a backup. One microgrid that I'll be comfortable saying is a straight up microgrid is the Veolia plant in the Longwood district in Boston, serving power, hot water, heat, cooling to 7 hospitals. If the big grid goes down, the hospitals still have power because they've got their own power plant locally for a 10 square block area or however big the Longwood area is.
And so that folks who were asking those questions know, Sterling is actually a municipal light plant, and their storage project was part of a pilot, and they got some funding from the Department of Energy Resources and the Federal Department of Energy to do that project. But they are a municipal light plant. So, and one of the things that I will say with munis is frequently they do manage to get their grids back up and running faster than the big investor-owned utilities after a natural disaster, for instance.
Yeah.
So one last question, and then I think we should probably finish up. But somebody asked, does Massachusetts have the same issue as New Hampshire with investor-owned utilities, quote-unquote, sweeping RECs, which I have never heard of?
Yeah, I'm actually not. I'm not familiar with the term.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so whoever asked that question, we apologize. Neither of us know the answer to that. So thank you so much, David, and thank you so much, everybody who joined us tonight. This has been great. I will put the recording up online, and we will email it out to everyone so that you can share it with anybody you want to. So thanks again, David.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.